The final season of My Hero Academia just keeps delivering insane quality. Every time you think that they might slow down, that they might save some budget at the expense of animation quality, they just go and prove you wrong. And I am not just talking about the animation during action sequences, although all of that looks absolutely stunning. But I also think that the art direction in general is getting a lot of attention this season. The character drawings are crisp, the lighting is gorgeous, and there are some really creative shots. And, most importantly, the story itself is at the highest point with all the themes, emotions, payoffs, and parallels. If you go to the IMDb page, the lowest rated episode this season is episode 1, and even that has a rating of 9.1, so that perfectly illustrates just how good this season is so far. But let's take a step back. As always, I'll go through the episode and break it down mostly in order. If you are new here, hi, I am Jem, and I've read the entire bnha manga. But don't worry, I won't spoil any of the future events. I am here to review the episodes just as they are, because even if I know the end of the story, I am still experiencing the anime adaptation for the first time, just like all of you. With all of that said, let's begin. The episode starts with quick flashes of cells that grow into All For One and Yoichi as we hear heartbeat sounds. While the main purpose of that sound, obviously, is to show the beginning of the lives of Yoichi and All For One, I also like how that sound indirectly ties to Bakugo, whose heart had been damaged, but now it's fixed and beating as he continues fighting. I spoke about it in my last video, but this season has a very strong visual and auditory identity, and this little detail is another small example of that. Then we see the mother of Yoichi and All For One, and she's clearly in a rough place, drinking in an alleyway while pregnant and also giving birth under a bridge. Believe it or not, this was actually slightly censored compared to the manga, because in the source material, the narrator actually provided a bit more information. But I think that the team behind the anime adaptation made a good decision by stripping that scene down to the bare bones that were necessary to understand what's happening. The fact that this scene had no narration and was silent made it more eerie than the manga, even with a slight censorship. After the opening, we hear Present Mike talk about the early days of the existence of quirks, or, as they were called back then, meta powers. Over the course of the whole series, we've already gotten bits and pieces of the birth of quirks, as well as All For One backstory, but this episode finally filled in all the blanks and combined those pieces of information into a complete story. The presentation was so good that it doesn't even matter that we've already had most of that information. Yes, we already knew that meta powers brought chaos and divide into society, but here we get to actually see that. The next scene in this episode shows a group of people without meta powers who are clearly hunting people with abilities. And that alone tells us a lot about the state of the world during that time. Obviously, those guys don't last long because Child All For One shows up and just kills them all. That whole scene was so creepy, even if I knew what was coming. The music, the slow horror movie style head turn from All For One, the coloring, all of that created a mood that felt as if we were watching a different show than bnha. One thing that applies to bnha's story as a whole is how it treats common tropes. Some tropes are elevated to a new level, while other tropes get subverted. All For One, as a character, is no different. all the main villains of MHA have sympathetic backstories. After everything they have done, they can't be forgiven, and the show isn't trying to make us feel that way. But with all of them, at the very least, we see how they got to that point. And because of that, having a villain like All For One, someone who was just born evil, fits into the narrative beautifully. This backstory, unlike all other backstories, isn't meant to make him sympathetic. It's meant to show us that there was no hope for him from the very beginning. As the narration states, this child was born arrogant. As simple as that. It subverts the trope of villains getting tragic backstories, and at the same time it elevates the trope of a villain who's just evil for the sake of being evil. We see as Child All For One continues killing people for no reason and taking their powers. The neon lighting of that scene looked so good. It was different from how I imagined it reading the manga, but that's another great creative decision from the team behind the adaptation. We see Yoichi trying to fight back against his brother, and that once again cements the fact that it wasn't circumstances, but nature that made All For One evil, because his twin brother was a good person despite living a life that was even worse than All For One's. Listen to the sound of my cat purring. Okay, sorry for the interruption, let's continue. Another small but great detail is that the image of a hand being reached out and taken comes back once again. I spoke a lot about it in my review for the previous episode, but that's another example of a twisted and dark version of this theme that's so prevalent in MHA. Here, All For One always grabs Yoichi's hand in a possessive manner, even if there was a time when Yoichi tried to imagine that that hand was gentle and kind. In the next scene, Yoichi and All For One read comics, and we also hear some news on the radio where they talk about how the glowing baby is gathering followers to push for peace. That was a small but great addition to the story. It was efficient storytelling. We didn't need any more details about the glowing baby. A few sentences from the radio were more than enough to give us all the information we need, because all that matters in that scene is that All For One found that baby and killed him. All because people were gathering behind that child, and All For One wanted people to only look at him. It's also so twisted because the whole MHA story started with the story about a glowing baby. Especially in the anime. That recap was shown so many times, and now we find out that all this time there was a tragedy behind that story. I also want to point out two great things about the art from this scene. First, it keeps switching between Yoichi's eyes to All For One's eyes, highlighting the difference before it gets explicitly stated later in the episode. The second thing is the shot of All For One descending from the moon. The framing in the manga was different, so that's another example of anime actually elevating the source material this season. The next scene is All For One giving Yoichi a quirk as well as a name. We've already seen this before in a flashback, but here this scene got a bit extended, and, once again, the framing highlighted the difference in their eyes. Next we see the first meeting of Yoichi, Kudo and Bruce. This little part wasn't in the manga, actually. There, we jump straight to the scene in the tunnels. I feel like the anime added this scene of them meeting just to once again highlight just how similar Bakugo is to Kudo, especially in the close-up shot. Even the way they both hide the lower parts of their faces in their clothes is similar. If I had to critique something about the anime adaptation, then it's the fact that they removed the detail that Yoichi actually got to spend a couple of months with the resistance forces. The anime made it seem like the scene of them running in the tunnels happened right after the first meeting, but in reality, there was a time skip. The anime created the impression that Yoichi's quirk was transferred in the moment of his death, but actually, that happened at some point during his time with the resistance. In fact, while it was never stated clearly, it feels like the manga implied that Kudo and Yoichi might have been a thing, and that's how the transfer of power happened. And I'm not the only one who thinks that way, because it's a pretty popular theory in the manga community. However, that's literally the only small nitpick I have. Other than that, the tunnel scene was great. The animation wasn't focused on the action, but the art still created a great and very fitting atmosphere, and the close-ups of Kudo's and All For One's eyes were brought to life beautifully. The next two scenes are All For One and Kudo with Bruce reaching the same conclusion separately. It's interesting how in the past, the good guys used to hide in an old bar, while the villain was in a skyscraper, and it's reversed in the present timeline. Also, the red and blue lighting of the bar continues the consistent color theme of the whole flashback. Plus, red and blue, Kudo and Yoichi. Do I even need to say more? And while I'm still on this topic, another thing that ties the episode together is contrasts. Shiny eyes versus empty eyes, focusing on the hero versus focusing on the villain in the comics, red versus blue, and so on. Yoichi's speech about his brother is also presented in the format of contrasts. We see his words said in freedom, put in opposition to the words he thought while still in captivity. That speech ends with one of my favorite lines in the entire story, how All For One, the ability to give and take, could have been the kindest power in the world. Emiche always shows how quirks influence people's personalities. But at the end of the day, being good or being evil is still a choice, and we know which side All For One chose, even if he really could have done great things with his power. Next, we see a montage of All For One killing all the previous One For All users. We also get to see a quick glimpse of him meeting the Doctor for the first time. Most importantly, we get the thing that the fans have been begging for years, and that is a glimpse into the first fight between All Might and All For One. Those manga pages were iconic, and the anime adaptation also looked pretty crisp. I only wish those shots lingered a little longer, because they passed by in a flash, and I feel like because of that, they are getting less attention than they deserve. Throughout this whole show, All For One kept saying how All Might's face still haunted his nightmares, how he could still see All Might coming at All For One with his guts spilling out. And that moment was finally shown to the audience as well, so I really wanted to highlight it if you're not a manga reader. There is also another blink and you miss it detail. In Season 3, when All For One and All Might met again, one of the first things that All For One told All Might was asking if he was here to kill him again. That choice of words wasn't an accident, because this episode in the final season shows us that All For One was actually in the morgue, inside a body bag, implying that the doctor actually had to bring him back to life. No wonder All Might believed All For One was dead, because, well, he had been. And with that lovely revelation, the flashback ends and we pick up right where we left off with the fight between Bakugo and All For One. Here, All For One reveals another horrifying piece of information, and that is the fact that he wiped out entire Kudo's bloodline, even the women and kids who merely seemed close to him. That shot of bodies on the ground was genuinely chilling. But in the end, the resemblance between Kudo and Bakugo is confirmed to be just a coincidence. That's how MHA once again subverts a common trope. There is truly no connection between the two. What they share is the will to oppose evil. Kudo was the leader of the resistance in All for One's early days of reign, and now Bakugo is here to stop him at the end of that. The fact that they only share the same goal and nothing more fits with MHA themes, because the whole story is about dreams, about ideals, about fighting against evil, about helping each other, about working together towards a bright future. Bakugo being related to Kudo, or worse, being his reincarnation, looking at you, Naruto, simply wouldn't have fit into MHA. But now, this connection ended up being a great addition to the story. Now, let's go back to the actual fight. I feared that they had used up all action budget last episode, but I was so wrong, because the action this episode looked just as good as last episode. All for One's patience has clearly run out, and he prepares his last attack, which is basically releasing all the quirks that he has at the same time. Did this attack look better and more impressive in the manga? Sure, but guys, I can't believe they actually animated that monstrosity fully in 2D. When I saw it in the manga, I was honestly expecting 3D, similar to how they made Shigaraki's fingers back in Season 7. Doing this monstrosity from All for One fully in 2D alone deserves praise. Also, fun little detail, you can actually spot Hawks' face in there, since All for One has his quirk. Another thing I want to point out is that the same neon color combination comes back again in this attack. It seems like a small thing, but it ties the whole episode together visually. As Bakugo faces this attack, he thinks back to his past until eventually he says, "Izuku, I won't get in your way anymore." These words could sound ominous and be a clear death flag in different circumstances, but since we just had Bakugo's temporary death and revival, this line gets a double meaning. Sure, maybe a part of Bakugo was ready to die again trying to stop All for One, but I also feel like this line symbolizes that Bakugo won't get in Izuku's way because from now on, they will only stand side by side as equals. Also, the framing of that shot was great. It really felt like a young hero facing off against this overwhelming and all-consuming power. I love how the audience was kept in the dark about Bakugo's plan here. We see All Might telling him to dodge, and we see Bakugo himself just hovering in place and saying, "Please blow up," as it seems like there's nothing that can be done. And then we finally see All for One blow up from the inside. It sounds bad, but it was so satisfying to see his eyeball pop right out of his skull. He looked as ugly as a titan from AOT after taking a good beating. I want to point out that fighting All for One by using quirks creatively was a pattern from the very beginning. All for One is smart, it's hard to argue with that, but he is also completely blinded by his ego. He has an all-consuming, overwhelming power, and he believes that should always be more than enough to win. But now he is facing opponents who fight in a scrappy way. Bakugo, All Might in his armor, even all the heroes before that in Season 7. They don't have such overwhelming power, but what they have are good tactics and that scrappy fighting style that All for One simply doesn't know how to respond to, because in his mind, It's inconceivable that these people are even trying to oppose him in the first place. And that's the real reason he loses. Not because All For One is weaker, but because he's too arrogant. Bakugo sums it all up nicely with another iconic line. One quirk is all you need. He is obviously talking about All For One, who's coming at Bakugo with literally all the quirks he has, but this line also fits the relationship between Bakugo and Izuku. It would be easy for Bakugo to feel insecure that Izuku has multiple quirks and also brains to use them effectively. But now Bakugo is also in a place where that doesn't bother him at all. He understands that one quirk is enough, and the only thing that matters is how hard you work to become stronger. We see the ultimate howitzer impact from Bakugo that leaves even All Might in complete shock. We also see how Bakugo's stitches are barely holding, but Bakugo just keeps going. I want to highlight not only the animation, but the voice actor of Bakugo. My own vocal cords were hurting just listening to that performance. Here we also get a little bit of comedy by showing that Hawks' vestige inside All For One managed to turn his quirks against him. Hawks was presented to us as this incredibly charming guy and also quite a bit of a flirt. And it was so hilarious to see that even his vestige now has a lady in his arms. Every little bit of disrespect towards All For One was just beautiful to see. And then we get the actual final attack from Bakugo. It was insanely good. I already spoke about it in my previous review, but Emichi fights are good not because of the action choreography itself, but because of the deeper meaning behind each fight and each move. Here, Bakugo's final attack is also just an explosion. But look at the framing. He attacks with his right arm that's been previously shattered and mended by Edgeshot. The brace that All Might has given him also shatters. And one thing that was established about Bakugo's fighting style even back in Season 1 is that a big attack with his right hand is Bakugo's signature move. Izuku said that this is how Bakugo always starts his fights, but here, that's how he ends one. And all of that is crowned with Bakugo saying that this is our story, as his final explosion gets the exact same animation and the rendition of the exact same soundtrack as All Might's United States of Smash back in Season 3. Normally, you'd expect something like this to be reserved for the protagonist, but the beauty of Emichi is that both Bakugo and Izuku are All Might's successors, only in different ways. It's also cool how it was set up that One For All is destined to fight All For One, that Deku would eventually have to face All For One, but in reality, All For One never even makes it to Deku. It's another slight subversion of tropes. Plus, it's fitting that someone like All For One gets defeated by who he calls side characters. It's also great that All For One didn't actually die in that attack. Instead, his death was truly pitiful. A man with the greatest ego in this whole story died as an ugly baby, desperately crawling towards his dream and unable to even speak anymore. Bakugo didn't even have to do anything from that point, as All For One simply rewound into nothing. It was also a beautiful symmetry from the directing standpoint that the episode started with All For One's birth and it ended with him reverting to that same state of, nothing. Before I end this review, let's go back and talk about Bakugo for a bit. He is in an extremely bad shape. Just look at his right arm and how what's left of it was flapping behind him as he was ready to fall. And for a moment, Bakugo thinks that it would be fine to just rest, that he already did his job. And while that's true, that's also not Bakugo. He remembers what he had told Kirishima back in Season 4, how real strength is the ability to stand through anything. So that's what Bakugo does. He remains standing until All for One is truly gone. He says, "You don't win until you've won," which might sound silly on the surface, but because this is Bakugo, we understand everything behind those words. I love how All for One looked genuinely scared in that moment, how he instinctually used his mother's quirk, the first power he took. It was also such a badass moment for Bakugo to catch that with his teeth and explode it. We also get another comedic moment, as well as a breaking of the fourth wall, as we see Hawk's joke that the quirks are returning to their owners, before taking it back and saying that it would have been too much fan service. And the final scene of this episode is Bakugo trying to strike an All Might pose, then, very understandably so, falling down, but still holding his fist up in the air as he wishes Izuku good luck in his own battle. Everything about this was absolutely perfect, including the fact that in the corner of that final frame, you can even see Izuku's battle raging on in the distance. And those were my final thoughts about this week's episode. Thank you for listening. Please share your own thoughts in the comments. And if you are interested, you can subscribe, and I'll see you next week for the review of episode 5.